Let's discuss tax-free equivalent yield and tax equivalent yield. So a tax-free equivalent yield is if you're trying to compare a corporate bond or even potentially like a Fannie Mae, a Ginnie Mae, or FHLMC, something that's going to be fully taxable on all levels, federal, state, and local, to a bond that like potentially a muni bond that would be can be completely tax exempt if you're within the same state, or if it's a territory bond like a Guam, Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, and American Samoa type bond that's exempt from all levels. So you compare the corporate to the muni. So basically, what you're trying to ask is what return if I can buy a corporate that pays me 8%, what kind of return would I need from an equivalent muni to match that up? So it does obviously depend on your tax bracket and the taxation of and the different the tax bracket you're in and the taxation of the different items. So just to kind of go through a couple of them right off the bat. So, if it's a corporate bonds or government agency, so I'm talking about like the Ginnie Mae, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. Freddie Mac is kind of like a misnomer if it's FHLMC, even though it's pronounced like Freddie Mac. Even like a Sally Mae, right? Sally Mae, I think it's SLMA. Sally Mae. So that's like the student loans. Those are going to be fully taxable, right? So they're going to be subject to state, local, and federal taxes. Federal taxes, boom. Versus if we're going to compare it to a treasury, so a T-bill, T-note, T-bond, strip, tip. Remember, the strip is the zero coupon. The tips is Treasury inflation protected securities, where the principal adjusts upward. That's going to be it's going to be taxable federally, but no state tax and local tax. Then, if you compare that to, let's say, a muni that's issued outside of your state, that's going to be taxable not federally, only state and local. And it's going to be based on where you're at, right? Not where you bought the muni bond at. So meaning like if you're, a resident of North Carolina, you're going to pay North Carolina taxes, not, if you bought a Georgia bond, it's not, you're going to pay Georgia taxes. And then lastly, if it's a muni that's inside your state, that's going to be um, no taxes at all. Or, this would also apply to what they call like a territory bond. So that's going to encompass, let's say, Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, and U.S. Virgin Islands. And that's, regardless of where you purchase them, even if you're in Alaska and you buy a territory bond, it's going to be fully tax-free or tax exempt, however you want to call it. Yeah. So now the question is, when we're talking about tax-free equivalent yields, that's going to involve you potentially going, let's say, from something that's fully taxable, let's call it a corporate to a muni, but it could just be anything that's fully taxable to something that's not as taxable, right? And let's say the tax equivalent yields would be going from a muni to a corporate, muni to corporate, right? So an easy way to think about it, if you're going to go from corporate to muni, obviously you're gonna go from a higher number to a lower number, right? Because of course, because munis, because of the beneficial taxation, they're not going to pay you as much, right? Plus they're safer than corporates in general. So from a higher number to a lower number, right? Tax equivalent yield is going to go from a lower number to a higher number. And the way you do it is very, very simple. So let's say you're in the call it, let's just keep it simple. Let's say you're in the highest federal tax rate and there's no state and local. Let's say you're in the 37%, you know, 37% federal tax rate. And you know, you have a bond that pays you that you have a corporate bond that will pay you 8. So you're thinking, what would be the equivalent municipal bond return that would match up to that 8% corporate if I'm in the 37% tax rate? So all you do is you take 100% minus 37% federal tax rate. That's going to put us at 0.63 or 63%, right? 63%. 63%. And now what we do is we take the 8%, multiply it by 63%. And of course, you could convert that to a decimal too. You could do 0.08 times 0.63, and that's going to give us 0.0504. So that's the equivalent of 5.04%. So as you can see, when you're in a high tax bracket, you're almost jumping down like 50%. So it's pretty significant when it's pretty significant benefit. So that's why mainly munis are going to be for folks that are wealthier, right? So I mean, it doesn't really make sense if you're in the 10% federal tax bracket to be buying munis, right? So it also makes sense if you're going to multiply a fraction by another fraction, you're going to have a smaller number, right? So if you take 1/2 times 1/2, that's going to be equal to 1/4, right? So now let's go backwards, right? Let's say you're in the 37% federal tax rate and you have call it a muni bonds that will pay you, call it 5.5%, right? So now the question is kind of a, what kind of corporate bonds would you need? Corporate bonds rate would you need for it to be equivalent? So that would be the tax equivalent yields, right? Tax equivalent yields, TEY, tax equivalent yields, right? So now, in this case, we're going to go from a lower number to a higher number. So we're going to do the same thing with 100% minus 37%, 63%, except in this case, you take the muni bonds, 5.5%, and you're going to divide it by 63%, which also kind of makes sense. And let's just do that with decimals, 55 divided by 0.63. And it's going to give me 8.73%. 8.73%. So basically what that's telling me, very simply, is that if I want to buy a corporate bond, if I'm in the 37% tax bracket, and if I can buy a muni that pays me 5.5, in order for me to find a corporate bond that would pay me the same amount after taxes, I would need to find something that earns 8.73%. So with this, you can kind of shop around and figure out what benefits you the most. So this is a very useful tool to figure that out if you're interested in fixed income. And it also makes sense logically. If you're gonna go from take a fraction and divide it by a fraction, you're gonna end up with a higher number. So if you do 1/2 divided by 1/2, that's literally gonna be 1, right? 1/2 divided by 1/2, or 1/2 divided by 1/4 is gonna be 2, right? So you know, you could also flip the denominator on the second fraction, the number you're dividing it by, and multiply it by that. So, yeah, so like 1/2 divided by 1/4, you take the inverse of 1/4, which is 4. So 4 divided by 2 is 2, right? So yeah, this is kind of the way that you can mess with the tax equivalent yields and the tax-free equivalent yields. I mean, the only other trickery you could consider is if you had like a whole array of bonds. So let's say, you know, you had like a 10% corporate bonds. And let's say just right off the bat, let's say you're in the 37% tax bracket and you're subject to 10% state and local taxes, right? So let's say if you could possibly get a 10% corporate versus a 9% federal, which is not going to happen. Of course, it's like over exaggerating, but let's say theoretically, in theoretical worlds, like a T bond, right? And then let's say if, yeah, I mean, if we actually had a 9% T bond, then obviously we'd have a serious problem with paying back the debt because of, the high interest, but that's kind of a side note. Then let's say you had call it like a 6%, uh, let's say 6% out of state, um, yeah, let's say out of state muni bonds, right? And then let's say you had a 5.5 in-state muni bonds. So the way you would compare these is sort of a variation of the um of the tax-free equivalent yield. So you're going to take all of these and try to convert them to the after-tax return, right? So you could theoretically convert the muni into what it would be taxable, but it's easier to just go from the taxable to the non-taxable. So you basically what you do is on the corporate, you're subject to full taxes, right? So you'd multiply 10% times 100 minus 47%, which is 53%, which in this case, 10% times 53% should be 5.3%. So right off the bat, the muni beats that, right? So now we know it's not going to be the corporate. So the objective of this question would be which would be the best return to the client. Now let's say if it was a 9% T bond, right? So now you'd multiply that. So for a T bond, paying you're paying the federal, but you're not paying the state and local. So in this case, you'd multiply the 9% times 100 minus 37 because you're avoiding the state and local, which is going to be should be put you at 63%. So the question is going to be 63% times 9%, 0.063. I'm sorry, 0.63 times 0.09. That's going to be 5.67, right? 5.67. So this looks like it would be a little bit higher. I mean, again, you're not going to have a 9% T-bond, but just for the sake of this question, because of the fact that you're avoiding the state and local, that you're getting a higher amount. So you end up getting a higher amount after taxes, 5.67%. And that beats the in-state muni bonds. So let's just check the out-of-state muni bonds. I'm looking based on the numbers. It looks like this is probably going to be the highest, but let's just check that. So in this case, you're going to avoid the federal taxes. You're just going to be subject to the state and local. So you just multiply this by 100% minus 10%, and that's going to be 90%. So 90% times 6% should be 5.4%. So in this made up example, the highest return would be this T-bond. Again, in real life, that's not going to happen because you're not going to find a T-bond paying you 9%. Especially in this low interest rate environment, you're probably not going to find a corporate that's paying you 10% unless it's, a like really, really low rated, maybe, super junk, maybe like, yeah. So that would, yeah, but in this case, because it's you're not paying the state and local, you're still paying 63% times 9% is going to be 5.67. So hope this makes sense and listen for more. Thanks.